Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending where you are. Welcome to today's FutFinInfo webinar. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Huan Tang from LSE, who will present today, and also Christine Parlour from UC Berkeley, who will be the discussant. So Huan is the last year's winner of the AQR Best PhD Graduate Award. So I guess we can expect to hear more from her in the future. And today she will talk about the value of online privacy and evidence from online borrowers. Huan has opted to take questions as we go. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat, or just type that you have a question in the chat to me as the host. And then once I see that there are a couple of questions lined up, I will stop Huan, and then we can take those questions. So that in this case, the presentation will be about 45 minutes, and including any questions in the meantime, and then Christine will have 15 minutes to present her discussion. After the seminar, there's also we have a slide buffer of about 15 minutes to wrap up. The official time is 1 hour. So without further ado, please, Huan, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me thank Michael for including me to this exciting webinar series. And also many thanks to Christine for agreeing to discuss the paper despite the very large time difference. It must be very challenging. So the starting point of this paper is the tremendous growth of the fintech sector in the past decade. For example, in 2018, total global VC investment in fintech companies reached 112 billion, while the year of 2019 saw over 5 trillion transaction volume in major fintech sectors, including digital payments, personal finance, and alternative lending. A key innovative aspect of this fintech business model is really the use of customer data to either improve capital allocation efficiency or to directly generate revenue. Let me give you 2 examples. A fintech unicorn, Cabbage, which is an online small business lending platform, uses borrowers' social media pattern data to help make loan decisions. Another fintech unicorn, Credit Karma, that offers free credit reports to millions of people on a weekly basis, that actually collects revenue from targeted advertising by financial companies on the platform. For both companies, data is a key driver of their revenue generating process, but data does not come for free because individuals may be reluctant to share their personal data due to privacy concerns. Therefore, naturally, the potential of this business paradigm is constrained by how much data can be collected from individuals, or how willing people are to share personal data with such online platforms. Therefore, in order to understand the constraints for fintech growth, we need to know the value of privacy. Now, beyond the fintech context, understanding the value of privacy also has more general implications, especially given the frequent data breaches we have seen over the past 2 decades. Since 2000, there have been 18 large-scale data breach incidents, each of which involved more than 20 million victims. This graph also shows the annual number of data breaches in the light blue bar and the number of exposed records in million, and in the dark blue bar in the US from 2005 to 18. It's very clear that there is a significant upward trend. And partly as a response to this trend, we have seen significant regulatory moves around the globe. For example, in 2018, the EU implemented the General Data Protection Regulation, and the California Consumer Privacy Act also went into effect in 2020. However, there have been tons of ongoing debates or discussions about whether it is really beneficial to have those very strict regulations or not. A line of arguments that's really against having this regulation is related to the so-called privacy paradox, which is, people always say they care about privacy, but in reality, they easily relinquish access to their personal data to online platforms such as Google and Facebook. In addition, evidence based on small-scale lab experiments often reveals very small to zero value of privacy. So is it really useful to have privacy protection regulations? And in order to contribute to this debate, we also need to have a precise measure for the value of privacy. Motivated by those debates and observations, this paper investigates a very simple question. Do people attach a positive value to personal data? If they do, how much? Can we put a dollar amount on that piece of value? And what are the implications for fintech firms? In order to answer this question, we face an empirical challenge, which is it is quite difficult to measure the demand for privacy or individuals' willingness to pay for privacy. I address this empirical challenge using a real-life context, which is online lending in China. This is a particularly suitable setup to study privacy issues because online borrowers in China face a very clear trade-off between privacy and credit access. Let me explain. There are two very important features about the Chinese consumer credit markets. First of all, there's no well-established official credit bureau in China, which means that online lenders often need to collect extensive amount of information from borrowers, and privacy may be a concern there. And second, only 25% of the population have access to credit card issued by banks, which makes online lending a particularly popular borrowing options for borrowers. And as of 2018, the total loan amount outstanding in this market exceeded 210 billion, which represent over 50% of the global market. So this context itself is an important context to ask what's the trade-off faced by borrowers and how much they value their data privacy. Within this context, I also explored two very large-scale field experiments implemented on a major Chinese online lending platform. Those two experiments involved 220,000 participants, and they offer randomization in both the amount of information collected from borrowers and the cost of borrowing. And on top of that, I developed an estimated structure model, which not only allows me to estimate the value of privacy, but also allows me to assess how borrower welfare and platform profits respond to different data collection policies. Now, here's a preview of the key findings. The headline result is that online applicants value their social network ID and employer contact at $33, which is more than half of the average daily salary in China. It also represents 8% of the value of a foregone loan for successful borrowers. Therefore, it is a sizable number. In addition, I dig into the mechanisms for why people are reluctant to share information. I show that their reluctance is not driven by risky applicants having an incentive to hide negative information regarding their credit worthiness. It's also not driven by the large efforts required to complete the questionnaire. And I find evidence consistent with them having an intrinsic preference for privacy. Last, the results from the structure model are really about the cost of data collection for both borrowers and for the platform. On the borrower side, I find that requiring them to disclose these two additional data items, social network ID and employer contact, decreases their welfare by 13%. This is because they care a lot about privacy. What's more surprising is that collecting data also decreases the platform's expected revenue by 10%. It is surprising because you would expect platform to collect data for a good reason, but it turns out that this data is not really useful, but it hurts the platform because it prevents people from borrowing from the platform. So the decrease is largely driven by a lower loan demand associated with a larger or a stricter disclosure requirement. So let me now introduce to you the experimental setup by walking you through applicants' decision-making process. When applicants arrive on the platform, they first need to decide whether to disclose the information required in the application form or not. If they do, they move on to a second stage in which they observe loan terms set by the platform using all the information collected, and they decide whether to take the offer or not. For those who do decide to take the offers, I observe their entire repayment history. A typical loan on the website is about $540. It's amortizing over 12 months, average interest rate 11%, average fee 29%, and delinquency rate is about 15%. So we are talking about microloans. Now, two experiments take place independently of each other. The first one takes place at the disclosure stage, in which borrowers in the treatment groups are required to answer fewer questions, including their social network ID, employer contact, and marital status. I will be more specific about the first two data items in a minute. Well, the second experiment takes place at the take-up stage, in which there's randomization in terms of loan size and the cost of borrowing. Those two experiments allow me to gauge the marginal impact of both disclosure requirements and cost of borrowing on their loan demand. And by contrasting the two marginal effects, I'm able to back out the monetary value of personal data. So now let's start with the first RCT. What we will learn from this first RCT is whether applicants do attach a positive value to personal data or not. So the answer is going to be yes or no. And only from the second RCT, we're going to put the amount on the data items. Participants in the first RCT are first-time applicants who have never shared any information with the platform before. Upon arriving, they are randomly sorted into 5 groups, 4 treatment groups, and 1 control group. Borrowers in the treatment groups are required to answer fewer questions. Basically, they don't see the question at all in the application form. Those questions are listed as follows. The first one is their social network ID or QQ QQ is one of the most popular social network software in China. In terms of function, it's a combination of WhatsApp, Facebook, and email service provider. So with the person's QQ ID, you will be able to do 2 things. First, check up the person within the software or send a friend request. And second, send the person emails. So think it as a piece of email address. And in the second treatment groups, borrowers do not need to disclose their marital status. In the third one, they don't need to provide employer contact, in particular the landline telephone number of their employer. And in the last treatment groups, all these previous 3 questions are removed together. And I label those 4 groups as the no QQ, no marriage, and no landline, and delete all groups. How does the user interface look like? It is here. On the left, you have the first page. On the right, you have the second page. So there are only 2 pages in total. On the first page, borrowers are required to disclose some basic information, including their mobile number, name, national ID is similar to social security number in the US. QQ and marital status appear at the bottom half. In the middle, you also need to tell them your education level. While questions on page 2 are more work-related, profession, employer name, employer contact appears here. So before showing you the main experimental results, I want to present some balance checks. Here I'm plotting the distribution of various demographic attributes across groups, okay, with each bar representing 1 group. Across gender, age, education, mobile device types, all these different variables. As you can see, there's almost no discernible difference across the groups, which is reassuring about the quality of the randomization. Now let's have a look at the main results from the first experiment, which is the treatment effects of disclosure requirements on their willingness to complete the questionnaire. Here, what you see is the set of questions included for each group. Questions common to all groups are not displayed. The baseline completion rate for the control group is 30.76 percentage points. Dropping the QQ question from the questionnaire increases that rate by 1%. Dropping the marital status question, no significant impact. Dropping the landline question, again, pushes the completion rate up. And dropping all 3 questions together, a 1.3% increase in the completion rate. So what we can say from this result is just that people seem to be sensitive to QQ and landline, but not to marital status. But it's not necessarily driven by privacy concerns, as many of you probably are thinking. So here's a list of alternative explanations that I'm ruling out. It's very useful to go through all of them so that it can preempt or answer some of your questions. Let's have a look at the first one. The first alternative explanation is that maybe some applicants, especially risky applicants, don't want to disclose information because they are worried the platform may use that information against them, either because the platform used that information in pricing loan terms or because the information can be used in enforcing debt collection. If this is true, we would expect that only safe borrowers will be willing to disclose the additional data items. So a key prediction of this story would be that conditional on completing the questionnaire, people in the groups with more data questions are safer than people in the groups with fewer questions. And it's very simple to test this prediction, right? Because I observe their risk measures. So what I do here is I compare various risk measures across the 5 groups. This table simply shows the regression result of different risk measures on the 5 group dummies. The first line shows the average of that risk measure in the control group, and the next 4 lines shows the difference relative to the control group. I use different measures such as the loan grade assigned by the platform, whether the application is pre-approved, loan size, cost of borrowing, which also depends on borrower risk, and the final fraction of payments made, basically loan performance. And across all 5 metrics, I do not find a significant difference in terms of their risk, which rejects these hypotheses. Okay, so the next 2 alternative hypotheses are related, both related to the transaction cost required to fill out the platform. You may think, okay, maybe I don't have a QQ, that I need to spend effort getting one, or I don't remember my employer's telephone number, I need to spend effort digging it out. So let's have a look at this first one. If it's indeed driven by the exertion required to answer the questions, you will have the following prediction, which is conditional on completing page 1, okay? Some people will need to answer more questions, some people fewer, but conditional on completing page 1, those in the groups with more questions should be more exhausted. Therefore, they are less likely to complete page 2. And we can just compare the conditional completion rate of page 2 between these 2 groups. And I find that it is not true that after answering more questions, you will be less likely to answer questions on page 2, okay? So this is a way to test this exertion story. Another way to test this exertion story is to look at the sample by employment status. A key prediction of this is that, you know, if it's about how difficult it is to dig out your employer's telephone number, it will be presumably more difficult for the unemployed people to find back the contact of their previous employer than the employed people to find this contact for the current employer. But when I split the sample by applicants' employment status, I find that the treatment effects are entirely concentrated among employed people. This is consistent with the privacy story because the privacy content of a current employer's contact is presumably higher than your previous boss contact, okay? Now, last and very importantly, I also find evidence for intrinsic preference for privacy. Preference is something not directly observable, but we know it's often related to demographics. In particular, I find a stronger treatment effect for female applicants and for older applicants, okay? And I do not find heterogeneity across income and education groups. Those results are highly consistent with what has been documented about privacy preferences in the literature, such as in Goldfarb and Tucker 2012 AER paper, and the recent working paper by Prince and Worston. Those papers use data from other countries, but the patterns are highly consistent, and which I think another alternative explanation based on transaction cost or a diverse selection wouldn't be able to explain. What we learned so far is that people do attach positive value to some data items. The next step is to put a price tag on them. This is where the second RCT comes in which the treatment is loan size and cost of borrowing. In particular, borrowers in the control group receive regular loan offers. Borrowers in the first treatment groups receive loans twice as large unconditionally, And in the second treatment groups, on top of the increasing loan size, borrowers also receive an additional treatment, which is a fee reduction for an average of $130. What I observe is the take-up rates by groups. And just by comparing the take-up rates, it is quite clear that people prefer larger loans and people prefer cheaper loans. This is not surprising at all. What's more interesting is the magnitude of this treatment effect and how it compares to the magnitude of that in the first experiment. Now, let me combine the two treatment effects by taking the ratio and multiplying it by the size of the fee reduction. The resulting $30 is a back of the envelope calculation for the value of QQ and Landline, because what this $30 represent is the fee reduction that would exactly offset the drop in loan demand caused by these two additional data items. But of course, any back of the envelope calculation is subject to a few assumptions and caveats. One assumption I'm making here is that, these two groups of people, they need to have the same sensitivity to fee reduction or the same sensitivity to disclosure requirements, then you can directly compare them. But this may not hold in reality. And that's why I developed a structure model, which allows me to account for the sequential nature of their decision-making process. You first decide to disclose, then you decide whether to take the loan or not. So the group of people you have at the take-up stage is different from the group of people you have at the disclosure stage. The structure model also has additional benefit, which is it allows me to say something about the impact of data collection on borrower welfare derived from getting the loan from the platform and platform profit. I will be very brief about the model. So just to give you the big picture of the model, it's a model about borrowers' discrete choice problems. They have three decisions to make, very simple, okay? Disclose or not, take up or not, and repay or not. And I link each of these discrete choices to a set of borrower characteristics, who they are, where they are from, etc., to the level of disclosure requirements and to loan terms, okay? After applying some functional form assumptions, I end up with 4 estimating equations. I guarantee you this is the most complicated slides during my talk. So I have 4 equations instead of 3 because I separately analyze page 1 and page 2 disclosure decisions. So what do these 4 equations mean? Let's take the first one, for example. What the first equation tells us is how does the page 1 disclosure decision depends on borrower characteristics X prime, depends on whether the QQ question is included for that group, their valuation for QQ, same for marital status, and crucially, it also depends on their expectation on loan terms, because if they do not expect to get a loan, they wouldn't bother to disclose at all. And similarly for page 2 decisions, which crucially depends on whether the landline question is present, take up and default decisions depends on the actual loan terms. So if we were to estimate these 4 equations independently of each other, we will be estimating either 4 logit models or 4 profit models. Here's additional twist I have on top of that, which is I allow the unobservables in these 4 equations to be freely correlated to account for the potential selection effect. Let's say if the page 1 disclosure unobservable is negatively correlated with the default unobservable, then it means those who are willing to disclose are less likely to default. Then we have the typical adverse selection problem with respect to the disclosure requirements. Now, I've told you all you need to know about the model, except for the very crucial thing: how do we recover the value of data from these equations? It is very straightforward. Let's take QQ, for example. The value of QQ is given by theta over gamma. Okay, what is theta over gamma? Theta over gamma is essentially the loan amount you need to increase to the borrower for them to be equally willing to borrow when you include the additional QQ question. Similarly for marital status and for landline, you just need to take the ratio of the 2 relevant coefficients to get that value. And now let's have a look at the main results. What this table shows is the marginal impact of the questions and actual loan terms or expected loan terms on their disclosure decisions. Now we know how to calculate the value of these items, which is by taking the ratio of the two relevant coefficients. And I find that QQ is valued at $21 and Landline is valued at $12. So the combined value of $33 is actually pretty close to the back of the envelope calculation, which is 30 if you still remember. And this hints that there is no severe selection going on, which is consistent with the reduced form evidence I've shown before. Now, another way to interpret the magnitude of that value of privacy is also to compare it to the value of loans. Here, thanks to the separate variation in loan size and future repayment, I can back out their discount factor, which allows me to further calculate the present value of a loan for successful borrowers. And I find that a loan of $540 is on average valued at $420, which is because they have a very low discount factor. That's a form of liquidity constraint. So if we compare the value of QQ to the value of the loan, it accounts for 8% of the second value. And it is indeed a sizable amount. Now, the last slide I want to show you on the borrower side is what's the impact of asking for these two additional questions on borrower welfare, which is narrowly defined as the flow utility borrowers derive from getting the loan from the platform. So on the left panel, you have the average borrower utility measured in dollar term for each of the 5 groups. Borrowers in the control group on average derive 470 utility in dollar term from getting a loan. Well, if we move them from the control group to the delete all group when you don't have any of these questions, their utility increases by 7%, which simply comes from the fact that they need to answer fewer questions now. Well, if we switch to applicants, the same analysis for applicants indicates that moving applicants from the control group to the delete all group increases their welfare by 13%. So where does the additional 6% come from compared to the left panel when you have the same thing for borrowers? It comes from the extensive margin, in the sense that some applicants who would have not been willing to disclose now are willing to because you remove some questions. So there will be additional set of borrowers who are able to borrow from the platform and derive positive utility. Now, I only have 2 more slides to show on the platform side. So why does the value of privacy matter for the platform? This actually links back to the motivation I had at the beginning. It's because data is not really free, although there's no explicit price on the data. But by collecting data, the platform may have a lower profit just because now consumers are pissed off. They don't want to borrow from the platform anymore. So in order to assess the impact of data collection on platform profit, I follow a very simple 3-step procedure. Step 1, I predict the demand and the repayment probability for each applicant arriving on the platform using the demand system I've shown you. And in step 2, I pull these quantities together to calculate the platform revenue from lending. So the last missing information in this profit calculation is what's the cost of lending for the platform. And since this is not directly observable, I estimate the cost of lending under the assumption that the actual loan terms, loan size, and interest rate maximize platform profit. And I find that for each dollar originated, the cost of lending is around 11 cents. So now I'm well equipped to calculate platform profit under different scenarios. Here, I'm just presenting one simple counterfactual case in which for the delete all group, we include back the 3 additional data questions. In the actual case or in the experiment, when they don't need to answer any of these 3 questions, the platform expects to collect $4.9 from each applicant arriving on the platform. Once you include these 3 additional questions, that number drops by 50 cents or by about 10% to $4.4. Therefore, it is not optimal for the platform to collect QQ or Landline. And very interestingly, after the experiment, the platform did decide to drop these 2 questions, which is consistent with the result here. So when you hear this result, you may think, why does the platform collect this information in the first place, right? It doesn't seem optimal for them to do that. So I think this is related to the fact that, you know, when the platform starts to operate about 10 years ago, they have no idea what information is predictive of loan default or not. So they start with a fairly large set of questions in the questionnaire to begin with. But over time, as they train their machine learning model, they start to realize these two questions, QQ and landline, are not so useful. But it seems to prevent a lot of borrowers from proceeding to the borrowing stage. That's why they decided to run this experiment. And they took the advice to drop the two data questions. Now it's the perfect time to wrap up. So first of all, I think the main contribution of the paper is to show that if you analyze the question of the value of privacy in a real life context, as opposed to survey or in a lab experiment, you do find that individuals attach a significant and positive value to privacy. And on top of that, the paper also shows that there are some scenarios where data collection could lead to a debt weight loss. So it's not optimal for consumers because they care a lot about privacy. It's also not optimal for the platform to collect data if those data are indeed not that valuable in predicting relevant economic outcomes, which is loan default in my setting. And this paper, in that sense, offers a generalizable methodology for firms and regulators to price such data items, to identify such data items, or in case they're interested in pricing different data items in different contexts, in different countries, this methodology can be easily applied as well. So that would be all. Thank you for your attention. I think I can take a couple of more questions before Christine starts.
Yes, thank you, Juan, for staying on time while dealing with questions. That's no small feat. So I suggest we move over to the discussion to make sure we don't run over time. And then we can still have a moment for additional questions afterwards. So, Christine, thank you for sharing your screen, and it is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Probably unmuting is a good place to start. So as we've heard, very clear presentation, but it's requisite on me to have a summary slide. So extremely detailed data from a P2P lender in China, 2 empirical approaches, great, I really like that. Randomized controlled trial and a structural estimation, with the top line estimate that the average or the value of privacy is about 70% of average daily salary, so this is quite large. And there's also a cost to the platform of foregone revenue per applicant. So before I start making any comments, I just want to say that this paper is extremely carefully done, and it's also really timely. So these are questions that we sort of are starting to grapple with. The data are very interesting, and I really want to know how you got it. And can I get some like this too, please? And I think one thing I also like is because there are 2 empirical approaches, you can sort of see why the structural estimates are useful, essentially because of the differences between pools and controlling for selection. So it really sort of highlights why you kind of want to do this. And, you know, clearly given all the sort of regulatory stuff about privacy, this is sort of an issue that we want to understand. So the basic framework of the paper, and I'm going to talk at a very high level, is essentially that, you know, certain questions are just inherently uncomfortable for people to answer, and people either dislike to reveal this information because of some utility reason, or they think that there's going to be a utility cost or a financial cost because the company will be hacked. So those are sort of the way the paper lays it out, those are the 2 things. And the company collects this data because it might help with identifying or pricing credit risk. And the results, as presented, suggest that it doesn't reflect credit risk, or too much data was being collected. And so the bottom line of the paper is essentially that collecting data under this framework is sort of a lose-lose activity. And it's lose-lose estimated around a particular level of data collection. So this might not expand linearly to every sort of data that you could imagine, but around this very particular point. So another interpretation, and Huan touched on this very briefly, but I think it might be worth pushing a little bit more on, is the variables that are being experimented on. Yes, you could view them as helping to define credit risk, but you could also use these variables to enforce contracts. So you think of a scenario that if you don't repay, what am I going to do? I'm going to phone your boss. I'm going to tell your friends. So very much you could think about these as being contract enforcements. And I think there might be a little bit more digging that you could do there, just because, so if I ask a question about contract enforcement and I choose not to answer, it could be that I choose not to answer because I know that giving you that information actually means it's very, very easy for you to enforce contracts. And I'm part of the small subset of the population, or I'm part of the population that combines a propensity not to repay my loans with being sensitive to this kind of social control. So the fact that people do or don't reveal it isn't necessarily about their privacy, but their understanding of how that particular variable could be used on them to enforce their contracts. The other thing about the sort of enforcement thing that might be worth thinking about is if somebody says, okay, and where exactly is your mother and how do I get in touch with her? You're probably going to update about how people are going to use that information. So in particular, the question itself could make consumers update about the platform's willingness or degree of aggression in enforcing contracts. Maybe they're getting this information because they're going to phone my mother. Oh my gosh. If I'm scared of my mother, then I'm basically not going to give this information because I'm the type that this is going to work with. So the different questions actually, if you think about it as contract enforcement, this perhaps leads to different perceived contracts. So the pool is not just defined by the price and loan amount, but the pool is defined by these sort of other things. So this might be something just to push a little bit. If you think about the sort of contract enforcement line, then what you really want to see is you want to see the loan results for those who didn't complete the forms. Because each time somebody drops out, basically they drop out at the point in which that is the piece of information that could be used to enforce their contracts. And so, you know, the observed negligible loan performance between the groups who do fill it out is sort of consistent with this interpretation. And this only matters, I think, if you want to, you know, to evaluate the size of the estimates and what they mean. So it's more an interpretation of the data. Okay. So just on a really high level, how do we want to think about a preference for privacy? So it could be there's something about my type that I don't want anyone to know. So a true preference for privacy. You know, this is the type of pajamas that I wear. I just really don't want anyone to know that. The other type of information about me or data about me is if I give you data about me, you can exploit me economically. And I'm worried about that. The other thing is, in a digital world, the only way in which I could interact with people is essentially by having a virtual presence. And if I give you the information that I have that identifies me virtually, then if there's a security breach, I lose control over my identity. So I mean, there are different ways that you can think about privacy, but those are sort of some of the ways that people talk about them. And it might be useful to be able to distinguish between a true inherent fear of somebody knowing what my pajamas look like, against something that's related to the fear that it's either going to be misplaced through a hack or misused, so exploiting me economically. And from a regulatory point of view and from an evaluation point of view, these means different things. So, and we should treat them differently. So to distinguish between, say, point 1 and point 2, so the sort of inherent with the economic exploitation, you need to have information on those who didn't finish filling out the applications and see if they would have been exploited, something like this. To distinguish between 1 and 3, you'd probably need data on security regimes. So you'd need to have information about hacks, or you'd need to have upgrades, or you need to have something like this, just to see whether or not potentially that's something that's driving. And the final set of things that I'd sort of flag is, you know, the fact that you calculate a loss of revenue in terms of foregone loans. This is really surprising, and it's really worth digging into. And I'd sort of be very curious to know if data can be sold or commoditized in some way. I mean, so in the US, there's a really, really vibrant data market. Is there a data sale market in China? Is there some way of commoditizing it? The other thing, or the other way to think about it, if you think about it back to the sort of contract enforcement view of these loans, the number that you see doesn't include the amount of contract enforcement cost that the firm would have had to have engaged in if those consumers had actually filled out the form, right? So to some extent, maybe in the data, if you take the contract enforcement stuff seriously, the apparent loss is in fact a benefit, because otherwise they would have incurred a massive cost to enforce contracts, right? So there's sort of that trade-off. The last thing about, just sort of in general about firms collecting the data is there's this sort of question about, you know, what element of identity do people really need to know to determine me as an economic entity? They don't need to know my height. They probably need to know my repayment probability. They may or may not need to know my gender, but it could be that there are economic variables that are, for which gender is very correlated, that affects my sort of economic performance. So there's this sort of broad question about, if you were going to design an information regime, what pieces of identity would you need to know to assess credit risk? And this is sort of an interesting and open question. Okay. So where am I going with this? Basically, I just find this a fascinating topic. And I think one of the things that's really worthwhile sort of pushing along from a research point of view is, you know, people use the word privacy, but there's really no precise definition. And you see this even in regulatory frameworks. So when people, you know, GDPR and the stuff that they've just done in California, the Online Privacy Act, there's this sort of sense in which sharing data is equivalent to violating privacy. And it would be very useful to sort of disentangle what is valuable or not valuable. And this is particularly important because as data can be stored and reproduced and used again and again, right? You can sell data very easily. As a commodity, we really want to be able to calculate how valuable that stock is. I mean, so we're quite comfortable when we do corporate finance to think about, okay, there's a firm and it's got a factory. Okay, the factory is worth $50. But if the firm is also sitting on a stock of data, we sort of want to know how to value that so that we can actually figure out what the size of the firm's assets are, right? This is a intangible asset. And, you know, further along these lines, just as a practical matter, if the reason why people are worried about having their privacy violated is because they're worried about a hack, then essentially you can evaluate the option to invest in security protocols that will prevent this happening. So just from a firm corporate finance point of view, we want to have estimates about what these costs are. I mean, we spent an entire generation on trade-off theory. Okay, let's start working out what the size of the data costs and benefits are. So I think this paper is a super interesting first step. I really enjoyed reading it. And, congratulations for getting the data and doing such a good analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine.
So Juan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, of course. There are so many good points that it will be very challenging to touch upon all of them. Maybe let me start with the easiest one, how I got the data, since I guess everybody is curious about it. So I think I'm lucky in that sense because I started to work on fintech since the first year of my PhD. Then I got this RFS publication, so which makes quite some people around me know that I'm interested in fintech. And there happened to be a friend who knows the CEO of that platform. So he connected me and the CEO, in China, things are not really done in a rigorous way. As long as the CEO approves, I don't even need to go through a very tedious legal procedure to get hold of the data. Which also says the privacy protection is not that good in China. I basically have the data sitting in my hard disk. Okay, so that's how. And the second point you mentioned that the valuation I have is basically applies to the time of data collection, and I completely agree with that. And I think by nature, the value or the preference for privacy is time varying. And in order to know how general this estimate is, maybe we can exploit some time variation in how many cyber attacks happened in local regions and see if there's differential reaction to additional question depending on the local exposure to these attacks. There is also a point on the contract enforcement. So I think I touched upon this point during, where I introduced one of the alternative explanations, which is if you're worried the platform is using that information in pursuing you when you default, you may be less willing to disclose considering you are a bad type borrower. So I would still think my test by comparing risk profiles across groups speaks to this channel. But probably you have something slightly different in mind. Oh, I have to mention, I forgot, the loan performance, the actual loan performance is post debt collection. So that's after the platform spent effort collecting debt, what's the eventual charge-off rate. So maybe that take into account one of these channels. And then there's a point on what motivates the preference for privacy. Yeah, I agree that in the paper, I didn't really distinguish between an inherent or intrinsic preference for privacy versus, I care about privacy because I worry there may be a cyber attack and my data will be exposed to a security things. I also think related to my previous response, I can exploit local exposure to cyber attacks and see whether there's some heterogeneity. The next point, why do firms collect the data? I also touched upon this point at the very end of my talk, which is, it's also surprising to me they collect the data for nothing because they do not use it in pricing loan terms or in chasing the bad borrowers. So my answer back then would still apply here, which is, they had no clue when they started the business. They have to start from somewhere. You can view it as a sort of experimental cost for these very edge-cutting fintech firms. Yes, it's true, they are not doing the optimal thing all the time, but it's through a practice, through a learning, they will converge to the optimal strategy in the end. And the last point about the definition of privacy, that's a question I got a lot during the market. When we talk about privacy, what are we talking about? And I really dig into the literature, which are mostly from the law field, you know. I try to go through papers. Do people agree on the definition of privacy? No, it's hard to come up with a consensus on that. So I do think this is an open question, how we as economists want to define data privacy, whether data is a commodity or related to human rights. It's still an open question. And I agree it's a very important one as well.
All right, so Christine, any follow-up to the response before we?
So the only thing I would say that if you look at ex post outcomes, unless you break out the enforcement costs.
Yes, so I can observe the loan default before and after debt collection. And I do not find that having that additional QQID and employer contact increases the probability of successful debt collection. So I think it clicks with the notion that the platform is not really using that information. One practical reason for that is that they actually, on top of that, they already ask you to provide 2 emergency contacts. Usually it's whether it's the telephone number of your mother or your friends, that maybe they will prioritize the usage in the process of debt collection.
All right, so thank you very much, Huan and Christine, for providing us with great insights on the value of privacy. So that concludes the official part of today's webinar. There are still a few questions waiting, so we can take them into the extra time. But so those of you who are interested, feel free to stay on, and to the rest of you, thanks for coming, and see you in the next event in the series in 2 weeks on November 11th.